Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to talk us through some work I have been conducting with Carly, looking at alcohol-related violence and antisocial behaviour and inequalities in victimisation by socioeconomic status. So I'm really pleased to be able to start this presentation by sharing that this work has actually been commended by the Office for National Statistics in their annual research awards for our collaboration. And it's been really well received in policy circles as well, which is really encouraging for us, especially, I think, as I talk through these findings, some are quite troubling and quite concerning. So the fact that people have been receptive to this has been really positive. And I'm sure that's something Carly and I will touch on a bit more later. So a finding we see time and again in the alcohol harm literature is one of inequality. So we know the burden of alcohol harm is not felt evenly across society. So whether it's health harm, societal harm, economic harm, these burdens are not felt evenly by all. At the same time, we also know that alcohol is linked to a substantial amount and array of crime. So a significant proportion of all violent offences that take place in the UK do so under the influence of alcohol. So information from the crime survey suggests that if the figure sits somewhere around the 2/5 mark, and there hasn't been much movement on that in the last decade. It definitely hasn't gone down. The alcohol use by perpetrators has been linked to many different types of violence, so murder, assault, sexual violence as well. And finally, when we think about disorder and what we might call antisocial behaviour, when we look at criminal justice records that are associated with this, we see that many of these instances are alcohol related. So there are these really strong links between violence and antisocial behaviour. Now, of course, when we talk about alcohol-related violence, that's a very broad category in and of itself. So it covers many sort of subtypes of violence that might have quite different mechanisms, but we're still seeing really strong associations with alcohol. So while we know domestic violence is complex and it has many kind of societal drivers, we also know that alcohol is a contributing factor. And estimates range anywhere from a quarter to 3/4 in terms of the proportions of perpetrators who were drinking at the time of their assaults. Similarly, when we think about stranger violence, data from the British Crime Survey, which is a victimisation survey from a few years ago, shows us that a substantial proportion of all these incidents are alcohol related as well. And of course, the nighttime economy is a setting where we see a lot of stranger violence. And when we look at instances of violence there, we see that these are proportional to the total capacity of alcohol outlets in these spaces. So the associations between these types of violence and alcohol are really clear. Similarly, when we think about antisocial behaviour, as I said, criminal justice records suggest a significant proportion of this is driven by alcohol. And while antisocial behaviour might be more subjective, it might be harder to measure, it's no reason to think it isn't impactful. So survey work has told us that for some people, experiencing antisocial behaviour affects their sense of safety, and it can drive people away from living in particular spaces. So it's something we should take seriously alongside these other violent incidents. So we were kind of left thinking, well, we know that we're seeing all of these inequalities in alcohol harm. We also know that there are these strong links between alcohol violence and antisocial behaviour. So what's going on in terms of inequalities here? Are we going to see inequalities in the victimisation of these incidents? And what do the socioeconomic kind of profiles look like for victims of alcohol-related violence and ASB? So our starting point, we found there is some research that's kind of looked into this or touched upon it, but the evidence is kind of a mixed bag. So while we have data from, as I mentioned, the British Crime Survey from 2 decades ago that suggests alcohol-related assault is more common amongst people who are unemployed. And we also know from hospital records that alcohol-related facial injuries disproportionately affect young men from socioeconomically deprived areas. We also have some international research using police records that suggests the opposite. So some work in Australia found that there was greater rates of alcohol-related crime, which is a broader category, but in more well-off neighbourhoods. While there is some drawback to using police records in to measure these kind of rates of crime sometimes, we're still left with this kind of mixed picture that we wanted to confirm kind of one way or the other. We also realised that even in the little that had been done, there was no real attempt to disaggregate, like I mentioned, the different subtypes of violence, so particularly domestic violence. And like I said, there's no reason to expect that the mechanism behind alcohol-related stranger violence and alcohol-related domestic violence would be identical, and it might result in very different patterns of victimisation. So we thought that was something really important, that if we want to understand any kind of pattern in victimisation as a whole, we need to get a handle on these subtypes and what's going on at that level as well. And then finally, we obviously also know a great deal about what puts a person at risk of violence in general, but also at risk of alcohol-related violence specifically. So factors about a person such as their age or behavioural factors like how long they spend in nighttime economy spaces might raise or lower someone's risk. So we thought it important, whatever patterns we saw in socioeconomic victimisation, that we saw whether or not these could be explained by these other known risk factors. So that's what we set out to do. We used data from the Crime Survey for England and Wales, which is a nationally representative victimisation survey, and it asks people just a huge amount of information, not only about incidents of crime of all kinds that they experienced in the last year, but also details about themselves, so kind of demographic information, and also things about such as their kind of experiences with the criminal justice system and things like that. So there's a huge amount of data there. And on the screen is just an example of the kind of variables we used when we were looking at violence specifically. So we used survey items that asked people whether they'd been victims of violence, and if so, what type, domestic, stranger, or acquaintance, and whether they suspected the perpetrator to be under the influence of alcohol. We conducted all of our analysis 3 times, each time using a different measure for socioeconomic status, because while there'll be limitations with each measure on their own, if we repeat with each of these measures and we see the same pattern of victimisation every time, we can kind of have a bit more faith in it, that it's not some kind of bug in the data, it's something real that's playing out. And then finally, as I mentioned, we included risk factors that might otherwise predict someone's likelihood of experiencing violence, to see whether these accounted for any SES pattern we saw. So again, biographical information and things about a person's behaviour and their time spent in the nighttime economy. So we did two things. First of all, we calculated incidence and prevalence rates for each type of violence and ASB by a person's SES. So we have incidence rates, which are the number of incidents per 1,000 people, and a prevalence rate, which is the proportion of people who experienced that violence at least once. So it's worth looking at both, because the gap between them can sometimes tell you something about how much repeat victimization is going on, for example. Once we'd done that and we'd established patterns in victimization, we then perform regression analyses to see if those other risk factors I spoke about accounted for any of the patterns we were seeing. So this is quite an intense table of results, but I'm going to take us through it sort of one step at a time. So first of all, we're going to look at alcohol-related violence. So when we look at alcohol-related violence, so any kind of violence, and we use either household income or occupation as a measure of somebody's socioeconomic status, we see that the lowest socioeconomic groups have the highest prevalence rate for this violence. So they're the most victims proportionally in these SES groups. When we look at housing tenure, it's actually private renters that have the highest prevalence rate, but social renters still have a much higher prevalence rate than owners. So we're generally seeing this pattern of victimization kind of clustering in the lowest socioeconomic groups. But what happens when we break things down by violence subtype? So if we look now at alcohol-related domestic and acquaintance violence, we see these patterns much more pronounced. So by any measure of SES, the prevalence rate for alcohol-related domestic violence and acquaintance violence is highest in the lowest socioeconomic group. And when you look at incidence rate, it's highest for 2 of the 3 SES measures we used as well. So the patterns are much clearer here. It's those in the lowest socioeconomic group that are feeling this burden most heavily. When we move to look more closely at some of these disparities, some of these are really quite staggering. So what I've zoomed in on here is the incidence rate, so the number of incidents per 1,000 people for alcohol-related domestic violence when you measure socioeconomic status by housing tenure. So social renters are experiencing 14 times as many incidents of this violence as owners. So these gaps these are big gaps we're talking about sometimes. If we think about stranger violence, the pattern is kind of gone altogether. It's much more mixed. If you measure SES by housing tenure, it looks like private renters are kind of doing worse. But if you measure it by household income, it's those in the highest SES group. So the pattern's kind of disappeared here. And that makes sense when we think about the overall alcohol-related violence pattern that we saw in the beginning. Really, it looks like that's being driven by alcohol-related domestic and acquaintance violence. Those inequalities are so strong there, and they're coming through in alcohol-related violence overall. So now if we think about alcohol-related antisocial behaviour, so the crime survey asks people whether they experienced this in the last year. And as you can see, there's really not much of a pattern here. Experiencing this is kind of spread evenly across all socioeconomic groups. But when we zoom in on these people who did experience it at least once last year, that's when we start to see really kind of staggering patterns. So this is showing when you ask these people who've ever experienced this ASB, how often did you experience this last year? Was it once or was it more often? The lowest socioeconomic groups, more than half of the victims here were experiencing this every week or more. So when you think about those kind of psychological harms that we mentioned at the beginning, sort of damaging feelings of safety and things like that, they become so concerning when you think this is something that's happening to people week on week. And you can see from the graphs, this is the same kind of gradient we were seeing for violence. It's really falling most heavily on those in the lowest socioeconomic groups. So as I mentioned, we have looked at these patterns, trying to account for other risk factors for violence and see what that does. And even when you're controlling for these other risk factors that we know influence a person's risk of experiencing this kind of violence, SES, being in the lowest SES group, still puts you at greater risk of alcohol-related violence and alcohol-related domestic and acquaintance violence particularly. So there is something real going on here. And even when you're accounting for all these other things that might put somebody at risk. We're going to be repeating this same analysis for antisocial behaviour. We've been interrupted by COVID, but that will be coming soon. So I feel this presents kind of two things to think about. First of all, there's a real urgency to reduce this inequality. So as we know, price and availability of alcohol have been consistently linked to levels of alcohol-related violence. And we know that pricing interventions, for example, have been modelled to reduce other alcohol harm inequalities greatly. So when you look at alcohol health harms, something like minimum unit pricing has been modelled to improve health outcomes from those from the lowest SES groups to the greatest degree. And we think that's really promising and something we should be investigating for this violence as well. Secondly, I think it gives us pause to kind of reflect on criminal justice policy and alcohol policy more broadly. These big inequalities sort of suggest something structural is going on, and the policing of alcohol violence has tended to focus on nighttime economy spaces, and that's been kind of the action from government, and that's where energies have kind of been targeted. But as we saw, that's not where these inequalities are. These inequalities are in domestic and acquaintance violence that we might not be able to get at with those kind of policing interventions. And maybe we do need to think about these kind of population-wide measures if we want any kind of meaningful change in those gaps. So you can find this research published in PLOS ONE, and also a report published through the Institute of Alcohol Studies if you would like to read more. And like I said, we will have more work coming out regarding antisocial behaviour soon. So thank you for listening, and I really look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, so that, I hope you found that first presentation interesting. That was clearly an analysis at the individual level about people's victimisation. And what we wanted to do is continue the theme of looking at socioeconomic inequalities in violence as it relates to alcohol. This time I want to speak to you about an area level analysis. So how there might be inequalities in terms of the distribution of alcohol-related violence over in different places and spaces. So I'm going to speak to you about the role of deprivation and alcohol availability and how they shape trends in violent crime. This time I'm going to be looking at the police data, the openly available police data. So in this study, we set out to explore whether alcohol availability and deprivation in local areas affected rates of violent crime. And essentially this builds on research that examines whether the availability of alcohol outlets is associated with violent crime. And we sort of add to that mix a consideration of whether deprivation also plays a role here, whether it moderates potentially the impact of alcohol availability. There is, of course, a well-established literature that confirms an association between alcohol availability and violence, and also a well-established literature confirming a correlation between deprivation and violent crime. So we thought that consideration of both these things in tandem was important, as it remains unclear as to what extent these are independently driving trends in violence, or whether, as I said, deprivation modifies the impact of alcohol availability on violence. So in this study, we set out to link three different data sets. The first of which were some novel alcohol availability measures that have been derived from consumer data. The second were openly available police data that capture violent crimes, of course, only those that are recorded and reported to the police. And these include offences such as grievous bodily harm, sexual offences, and the like. I know Lucy mentioned that sometimes the police data isn't often favoured by criminologists, and they prefer the crime survey for England and Wales, but the police data have their own particular advantages. And in this instance, it's the fact that we can capture low-level geographic resolution, and of course some violent crimes come to the attention of the police that can't be captured by a survey, such as homicides, for example. And then our third data set was the index of multiple deprivation, so measure area level deprivation. And essentially, having combined these three data sets, we performed an ecological or area level analysis of the recent trends in violent crime amongst lower super output areas in England for the period between 2011 and 2018. The research questions that we set out to answer were threefold, namely, what is the impact of area level deprivation on violent crime? What is the impact of alcohol availability on violent crime, net of the deprivation effect? And is the impact of alcohol availability moderated by deprivation? So does it perhaps amplify or dampen any effect that we see? And just a brief background in terms of trends in violent crime. So very much a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot of literature on this in its own right. But there has been a general drop in crime since the 1990s generally, and violence is no exception. The crime survey for England and Wales, for example, show that violence had fallen between 1995 and 2014. But recently, this downward trend has been called into question as police recorded crime figures have roughly doubled between 2013 and 2017, and the crime survey has shown a flattening of that downward trend in violence since 2014 as well. So generally speaking, there's an interest in crime trends and violence therein more generally. But most of the analyses presented around rates of violent crime are done at the national level, and they thus obscure any differences that different areas might see within such trends. And within those kinds of analyses, very few have assessed here in England the variability across local areas conditional upon alcohol availability and deprivation. And so the fewer focus essentially on alcohol-related violence. And this is surprising in some senses because we know that the impact of alcohol-related harm is not uniform. We also know it is associated with socioeconomic status, and we know that crime is as well. And we also know that there is, a strong association as well between outlet availability, density, and violence. So previous studies that have examined alcohol availability have looked at its impact on alcohol-related harms more generally, so include mainly around health harms such as mortality, morbidity, those sorts of things, and fewer have focused on violence specifically. There are several studies that have done so, and in those that do, we can see that the availability of alcohol and proximity to outlets is known to increase the probability of violent outcomes for a range of different measures. And we also know that it is important to distinguish between the impact of on-licensed premises and off-licensed premises, given that there's varying mechanisms through which these might increase the probability of violence. So we heard, for example, Lucy talked previously about nighttime economy settings, which might be specific contexts in which people congregate together to partake in drinking, and thus there are increased opportunities, for example, to commit alcohol-related violence. We also thought it's very important to consider the role of deprivation, given its strong and established relationship with crime and violence, and how we know that the distribution of crime and violence are not evenly distributed across different areas. We thought it was plausible, given previous insights from other studies, that it was the same for alcohol-related violence, that those from deprived areas might be more likely to experience alcohol-related violence. And we see from other studies that alcohol outlet availability increases the risk of violent outcomes where those premises are located in kind of high-risk environments, and more generally that studies looking at spatial availability of outlet type find that amongst lower socioeconomic groups there's potentially more alcohol consumption in these places. So we also know, and I know you've had another event on the alcohol harm paradox specifically, we also know that generally speaking the distribution of alcohol-related harm is not uniformly experienced by everybody. We see a growing body of evidence that highlights that those of a lower socioeconomic status are more susceptible to and suffer a disproportionate share of the harm despite drinking less or similar amounts. And again, a lot of the scholarship in this space has focused on health harms, as I mentioned before, rather than criminal justice outcomes. So we're hoping to sort of buck that trend and consider how we might see similar patterning among alcohol-related crime. As mentioned before, we combined various data, and here's just a little bit more information for those that want it on those data sources. So over the 7-year study period, we have the violent crimes that are available openly at low spatial disaggregation, and there were sort of 67 million violent crimes that we were able to analyse and append to the lower super output area information on how many crimes there were. We were able to append measures of alcohol availability. As mentioned before, these were derived from consumer data that allowed us to calculate a median travel distance to both on and off licensed premises in the area. And finally, we then also recalculated the index of multiple deprivation, excluding its crime domain, because this is highly correlated with our outcome measure of violent crime, so that we could append as well a measure of what the level of deprivation in each lower super output area in England as well. And having done that, we were able to specify some negative binomial growth curve models to examine changing trends in violent crime across lower super output areas, conditional upon the deprivation profile of that area and the availability of alcohol in that area. And within those models, we also specified an interaction term to look at whether deprivation moderated the effect of alcohol availability. But now on to the interesting bit, the findings. Basically, some headlines are that our findings confirm an upward trend in recorded violence to the police in England between the 2011 and 2018 study period, and there was substantial variation in the areas studied as to how much violent crime they experienced, and indeed the inequalities that the areas saw, they became more pronounced over the study period. On the whole, recorded violent crime was higher in areas with higher deprivation and also higher in areas with more alcohol availability, especially in the form of unlicensed premises. Deprivation, we found that it played a really key role in driving violence. It was found to be stronger, have a stronger effect on predicting violent crime compared to alcohol availability. And it also important, this is really important, it also amplified the impact of alcohol availability, so in the form of unlicensed premises. So more deprived areas saw a stronger impact of alcohol availability in those areas on violent crime. And that is something that I think, again, is often, we will speak about policy implications in a bit, but often, kind of missing from some of the policy considerations and tools that we have at our disposal to modify or do something about. I will mention that we did also look at an interaction term for off licenses, and this was found not to be significant, but I want to caveat that finding with the fact that our off-license measures only looked at off-licenses and not supermarkets. So it's perhaps potentially misleading to say that there's nothing going on there. If I haven't mentioned it already, that's probably, again, why we see a sort of a stronger impact of unlicensed availability in the forms of pubs, bars and nightclubs driving violent crime compared to off-license availability in our findings as well. So again, some reflections from me on what this might all indicate. Given that we found positive associations between both on and off license premise availability and violent crime in our findings, this suggests that any attempt to restrict availability to such outlets is potentially an effective way of reducing violent crime as well. Restricting availability can potentially be addressed through planning and licensing decisions and restrictions, which would in turn free up criminal justice agencies and health organisations from some of the burden of alcohol-related violence. But of course, there are several challenges to being able to do this, not least because of the provisions available in the licensing legislation. Secondly, I just wanted to again reflect on that key role that deprivation plays and socioeconomic inequality plays. We do need to think about how we might more effectively respond to this unequal distribution of alcohol-related harm and violence in this instance, because of that disproportionate impact that some areas with high levels of deprivation are seeing. For example, we can potentially consider the density of licensed premises alongside the deprivation profile of an area in making decisions about licensing with a view to ameliorating and preventing violence. And finally, to echo a reflection of Lucy's in her presentation, thinking more generally about the sort of the structural drivers of socioeconomic deprivation and how we might more meaningfully intervene so as to reduce the level of harm associated with alcohol-related violence. And these types of interventions are perhaps rarer, and perhaps why we, as I say, see the problems that we see. And I'm really interested to hear from everybody attending today as to what they think might be meaningful ways forward. I know Lucy mentioned minimum unit pricing, cost duty, those sorts of things could be useful here, but I don't think that we have looked at it explicitly in relation to alcohol-related violence as yet. And then finally, I just wanted to end on a note. Clearly, these data from 2011 to 2018 and the analysis that Lucy and I were talking about before were from the crime survey prior to the pandemic. And the pandemic has shone a new light on health inequalities for sure, and we have seen inequalities more generally in terms of socioeconomic inequalities widen during this period. We've seen reports of domestic violence increase, and we've seen a massive move and shift to at-home drinking as a result of lockdowns that have been imposed upon us. And as we've seen, some of our nighttime economies and our unlicensed premises closed completely. So we are keen to think about future research to examine these inequalities and how they look during and post the pandemic. And we're exploring that currently. And this would be a really interesting time to perhaps it presents a unique opportunity for us to examine, for example, during periods of nighttime economy closure, the effect of at-home drinking on violence without the noise of the nighttime economy impact thereon. So it's an interesting time to pursue some of these other research agendas around what impact is at-home drinking having on violence if we take away consideration of the nighttime economy. That's a whistle-stop tour of research that is yet to be published. It's in progress. But I would open up, I suppose, at this stage to Lindsay to chair questions, thoughts, comments on either presentation. Thank you for your attention.